Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep these bedtime stories alive, and I promise there are many more waiting for you. Now, let's settle in and drift slowly into tonight's story. The Forgotten Letter Found in a Boston Apartment. It was late autumn of 2019 when Thomas Whitmore, a 35-year-old lecturer from Cambridge, England, moved temporarily to Boston. He had accepted a visiting research fellowship at Harvard, and with his modest stipend, he rented a small apartment on Marlborough Street, not far from the Charles River. The building itself was old, red brick, built sometime in the 1890s, with creaky wooden staircases and narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of varnish and dust. Thomas had always been fascinated by history, not just in books but in the lives of ordinary people. So when one chilly Saturday morning in early November, he decided to clean out the attic space above his rented flat. He treated it less like a chore and more like an adventure. The attic was dim, lit only by a single bulb that flickered as though it struggled against a draft. Dust motes swirled in the air as he opened the hatch. The sound of the street below muffled into a soft hum. Cardboard boxes, old trunks, and broken furniture crowded the space. He moved slowly, careful not to bump his head against the slanted beams. It was there, tucked inside an old leather suitcase with its straps cracked from age, that Thomas found the letter. The envelope was yellowed, its edges frayed, and across the front, in elegant handwriting, was written, Miss Eleanor Cartwright, Beacon Hill, Boston, 1947. His heart gave a small jolt. It wasn't just the beauty of the script, but the sense that he had stumbled upon a voice from another lifetime. He sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, brushing the dust away, and carefully slid the brittle paper out. The letter, written in blue ink that faded over decades, began with a salutation that immediately stirred his curiosity. My dearest Eleanor. The words seemed filled with longing, as though whoever had written them had carried a weight that could never quite be spoken aloud. Thomas read on, his breath slow, his surroundings forgotten. The letter spoke of nights by the river, of whispered promises made under Boston's gaslit streets, and of a separation that had been forced by circumstance. It hinted at a love kept secret, one that could never be publicly acknowledged. The writer, who signed only as J, promised Eleanor that one day the truth would surface, though whether he meant through confession or discovery was left unsaid. Thomas paused, the sound of the radiator knocking faintly in the apartment below, reminding him that he was not in some Gothic novel, but in real life. Still, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thicker, charged with a kind of presence, as though the letter had pulled something invisible into the room. He folded the paper carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. Questions crowded his mind. Who was Eleanor Cartwright? Who was Jay? And why had this letter been hidden away in a suitcase, never delivered or perhaps deliberately kept? That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The letter remained on his bedside table, its envelope glowing faintly in the lamplight. He lay awake, listening to the faint rumble of cars along Commonwealth Avenue and the occasional sound of laughter drifting from a nearby bar. The city outside moved forward, but inside his apartment it felt as if time had shifted backward, holding him captive in 1947. By morning, Thomas knew he couldn't simply let the matter rest. As an Englishman in a foreign city, he had always felt like an observer, but now he was entangled in someone else's forgotten history. With notebook in hand, he set out for Beacon Hill, determined to trace Eleanor's name through records, archives, and maybe even whispers from neighbors who still remember the old families of Boston. The cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, with their iron railings and brick row houses, carried the kind of silence that spoke of wealth and secrets. It was there, on Mount Vernon Street, that he first spotted a brass plaque with the name Cartwright engraved faintly upon it. His pulse quickened. Could this be the place? He stood there for several minutes, his breath visible in the cold air, before gathering the courage to knock. The door opened slowly, and an elderly woman, wrapped in a deep green shawl, peered at him with clear, sharp eyes. "Yes?" she asked, her voice calm but wary. Thomas swallowed, the letter heavy in his coat pocket. I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I recently found something in an old apartment, and I believe it may belong to your family." Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, as though she were weighing not just his words, but the very intention behind them. Then, with a small sigh, she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood and faint lavender. Portraits lined the hallway. Stern men in military uniforms, elegant women in formal gowns. Thomas felt as though he had stepped into another world, one preserved carefully against the erosion of time. When he finally placed a letter on the mahogany table before her, the woman's hand trembled as she reached for it. She stared at the handwriting for a long time before speaking. This was my mother's," she whispered. "Eleanor Cartwright." Her words settled heavily in the room, and Thomas knew that the story was only beginning. The elderly woman's hand lingered over the letter, her fingers brushing the faded ink as though afraid it might crumble beneath her touch. She did not open it right away, though Thomas could see the pull of memory in her eyes. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, she looked up at him. "You said you found this in your apartment?" she asked softly. "Yes," Thomas replied, "in a suitcase in the attic. I don't think anyone had touched it for decades." The envelope was addressed to Eleanor Cartwright, and from the way you speak, I take it she was your mother. The woman nodded, lowering herself into a high-backed chair. Her posture was upright despite her age, and there was a quiet dignity about her. "My name is Margaret," she said. "Margaret Whitfield. I was Eleanor's only daughter." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had not expected to meet a direct descendant so quickly. Sitting across from him was a living bridge to the woman whose name had been scrawled in delicate ink 70 years ago. Margaret finally opened the letter, her lips moving slightly as her eyes skimmed the page. For a long while, she read without speaking, the air heavy with anticipation. When she reached the end, she exhaled deeply and placed it back on the table with careful hands. "I always knew there were things my mother never told me," Margaret said at last. "She was a proper lady in the eyes of Boston society, married well, attended all the right gatherings, hosted dinners in this very house. But there was always something in her silence, something unfinished. This letter," her voice trailed off. Thomas leaned forward. "Do you know who Jay might have been?" Margaret's eyes flickered to the portraits lining the wall. "There were whispers when I was young. My father was often away on business, and there were rumors that my mother had once been close to someone else before their marriage. But names were never spoken. In those days, reputation was everything." She looked at Thomas with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. "Why did you bring this here, Mr. Whitmore?" Most would have tossed it aside. Thomas hesitated, then spoke with sincerity. "I suppose I want to understand it. I'm a historian, you see, not just of wars and kings, but of people, ordinary lives, hidden truths. When I held this letter, it felt as though someone's voice had been waiting all these years to be heard." Margaret regarded him silently, then gave a small nod. "Perhaps it was meant to be found by someone like you." They sat together for a while, the shadows in the room lengthening as the late afternoon light dimmed outside. Margaret poured them both tea, and as they drank, she told him fragments of what she remembered. Eleanor had been a devoted mother, but she rarely spoke of her youth. The name Jonathan Harrington surfaced once, when Margaret was a child, overheard in hushed conversation between her mother and an old friend. The memory had stayed buried, insignificant at the time, Until now. Thomas noted the name down in his journal, the excitement of discovery buzzing in him. Harrington. Such a name surely existed in the city's records. He promised Margaret he would look into it, not for gossip, but for history's sake. That night, back in his apartment, Thomas could not rest. He placed the letter on his desk, lit only by a small lamp, and stared at it as though it might speak. He copied the words carefully into his notebook, tracing each line, each pause in the handwriting. The letter hinted at stolen evenings, at music drifting from a bar near Charles Street, at a promise made before one of them had to leave. The more Thomas read, the more he felt as though Eleanor and Jay had existed in a fragile world just out of reach, desperate to be remembered. In the days that followed, Thomas immersed himself in research at the Boston Public Library. He combed through city directories, yearbooks, and society columns. He found mention of a Jonathan Harrington, a young man of distinguished family, whose name appeared frequently in 1940s newspapers. He had served in the Navy during the war, returned briefly, and then, suddenly, his name disappeared from the public record around 1948. The dates aligned too neatly. Thomas's pulse quickened as he scribbled notes. Later, walking through the streets of Beacon Hill, he found himself imagining the life Eleanor must have led. The gas lamps still glowed at night, their soft yellow light illuminating brick walls that had witnessed decades of whispered promises. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves, and the cobblestones carried echoes of footsteps from another century. When he returned to Margaret with the name, her eyes widened with recognition. "Yes," she whispered. "Harrington. I recall overhearing my grandmother scolding my mother once. She said Eleanor had been foolish to risk so much for him. I didn't understand then. Now it makes sense." Thomas felt the pull of the mystery tightening. "Do you know what became of him?" Margaret shook her head. "All I know is that he vanished from her life, and she never spoke of him again. But she kept this letter. She must have kept others, too." The idea struck Thomas like a spark. If there was one letter, hidden away in a suitcase, there might be more. He asked if Margaret still had her mother's belongings. She nodded slowly and led him upstairs to a small, seldom used room. The air smelled of cedar and age. In the corner stood a wooden chest, its brass lock tarnished with time. Margaret unlocked it with a key that had hung for decades on a chain in her desk. Inside were folded linens, delicate gloves, photographs in black and white, and beneath them, a bundle of envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon. Thomas's breath caught. Margaret lifted the bundle carefully, her hands trembling. "I never had the heart to go through these," she admitted. "Perhaps you should." Thomas untied the ribbon slowly, reverently. The letters were all from Jay, spanning several years. They spoke of meetings by the river, of music in smoky bars, of long drives up to the North Shore. They spoke of a love that grew in secret, pressed down by the weight of expectations and family pressure. The last letter, dated 1948, ended abruptly. "If this is the last time I write, know that I never stopped loving you. Forgive me." The words burned in Thomas's mind. Something had happened in 1948, something that silenced Jonathan forever. That evening, Margaret sat beside him in silence, her eyes glistening as she read. "All those years," she whispered. She carried this alone. Thomas placed a hand gently on the table. "We can still uncover what happened. There must be records, military, hospital, something. If Jonathan disappeared, the truth must be somewhere." The next weeks blurred into a rhythm of archives, libraries, and late-night writing. Thomas discovered that Jonathan Harrington had died in a car accident on a snowy road outside Boston in January 1948. The newspaper obituary was brief, clinical, but to Thomas it was a devastating confirmation. He returned to Margaret with the news. She listened quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks, before nodding. "So that was it. she said softly. She lost him, and she bore it in silence. My father never knew, I think, and she just went on living, raising me, playing her role. The house was quiet, filled with the faint scent of old wood and lavender. Margaret's grief was not only for her mother, but for the story that had been hidden for so long. For Thomas, the discovery stirred something deeper. He was far from home, a stranger in Boston, yet he felt more connected to the city through Eleanor and Jonathan than through any guidebook or fellowship. Their story had drawn him in, tethered him to cobblestone streets and riverbanks he had never walked in their time. One evening, he found himself standing by the Charles River, the wind cold against his face. He imagined Eleanor and Jonathan there, 70 years earlier, their words carried away by the same current. He thought of the letter, folded and forgotten, waiting in the suitcase all those years until it reached him. The story was not finished. He felt it in his bones. There were more voices in Boston's shadows, waiting for someone to listen. And now that he had begun, he could not turn away. The days grew shorter as December settled in, and Boston's streets glowed beneath strings of holiday lights. Yet Thomas hardly noticed the cheer of the season. His mind was consumed by the letters, by the story they told, and the silences they left behind. Each evening, after hours spent at Harvard's library, he would return to his apartment and pore over them, reading the same passages again and again, as though the ink itself might yield new secrets if studied closely enough. He began to draft notes for a possible paper, not for academic publication, but something more personal. The story of Eleanor Cartwright and Jonathan Harrington was not simply history. It was human, fragile, filled with the ache of love cut short. It deserved more than the dry tone of footnotes and citations. It deserved to be told with the weight of an emotion intact. Still, doubts gnawed at him. Who was he, an Englishman barely settled in the city, to tell a story so intimate to Boston's past? What if Margaret regretted sharing it? What if he misrepresented Eleanor, turning her pain into narrative for the sake of curiosity? One snowy evening, he decided to visit Margaret again. The Cartwright house looked solemn under the falling snow, its windows glowing faintly. Margaret welcomed him in with her usual quiet grace, leading him to the sitting room where a fire crackled on the hearth. "I've been thinking about your mother's letters," Thomas began carefully. "They tell a story that feels larger than just two people. It's about the times they lived in, the choices forced on them, the silence that followed. I believe others could learn from it." Margaret sipped her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on the fire. After a long pause, she said, "For years I wondered what burden my mother carried. Now that I know, I feel both sorrow and relief. But if her words are shared, they must be shared with respect. She deserves dignity, not gossip." Thomas nodded earnestly. "That's exactly my thought. I want to tell it as history, but also as testimony to their love." Margaret studied him for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "Perhaps it was meant to find you, Mr. Whitmore. My mother held on to those letters all her life, but for what purpose, I never knew. Maybe the purpose was that someone one day would give her voice again." Encouraged, Thomas promised to write carefully, to show Margaret every draft, to ensure the story remained theirs as much as his. Over the following weeks, his small apartment transformed into something between an office and a shrine. The letters lay neatly on his desk, beside stacks of notes and reference books. He mapped out timelines: when Jonathan returned from the war, when Eleanor married, when the letters began and when they ended. He traced their meetings to locations still standing: the river, the smoky bars on Charles Street, the roads leading north toward the sea. On weekends, he retraced those paths himself. He stood on the icy banks of the Charles, listening to the wind cut across the water. He visited Beacon Hill at dusk, when the lamplight blurred the line between past and present. He even traveled north to Gloucester, where one letter had mentioned a winter drive to watch the sea crash against the rocks. The ocean was gray and endless, its roar echoing in his chest. He imagined Eleanor and Jonathan there, wrapped in coats, their voices nearly drowned by the surf. Yet the more he immersed himself, the more restless he became. At night, he dreamed of voices whispering, of a woman's hand reaching across time. He would wake with the sound of the letter's words echoing in his mind. If this is the last time I write, know that I never stopped loving you. The story began to blur with his own life. He found himself distracted during lectures. His thoughts wandered to Eleanor instead of his research. Friend from Cambridge wrote to him, but he delayed his replies. The city itself seemed to conspire in keeping him bound to the past. Every brick, every lamplight, every shadow carried echoes of what it uncovered. One evening in January, while sorting through newspaper archives, Thomas found something he had missed before. In the days following Jonathan Harrington's death in 1948, a small notice had appeared in the Society column. It mentioned that Eleanor Cartwright had been indisposed and absent from several social events. The phrasing was vague but suggestive. Could it be that she had withdrawn, overwhelmed by grief, forced to conceal her mourning under the guise of illness? The thought unsettled him. The image of Eleanor, confined to her home, her sorrow hidden from all but her closest confidants, made the story feel unbearably real. Driven by the discovery, Thomas began drafting his manuscript in earnest. He wrote late into the night, his pen scratching across paper as snow fell quietly outside. He described Eleanor's life in detail, the society events, the rigid expectations of her class, the loneliness hidden beneath polite smiles. He described Jonathan's return from the war, the weight he must have carried, the relief of finding someone who understood him. He wove the letters into the narrative, letting their words speak for themselves. But as the manuscript grew, so did his unease. Sometimes, while writing, he felt as though someone stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. At first, he dismissed it as imagination, the product of too many late nights. But one evening, as he reached for his cup of tea, he noticed the envelope at the edge of the desk had shifted. Though he was certain he hadn't touched it, he froze, the room utterly still, the radiator hissed, the only sound in the quiet apartment. Slowly, he returned the envelope to its place and forced himself to continue writing. The sensation persisted, a presence, faint but insistent, not menacing but watchful, as though Eleanor herself lingered, ensuring her story was told with care. When he confided this to Margaret, she did not laugh or dismiss him. Instead, she placed her hand gently on his. "Perhaps it is her," she said softly. "Perhaps she waited all these years for someone to carry her truth. If you feel her near, then write with her beside you." Her words steadied him. From then on, whenever he felt the air stir or the silence grow heavy, he would whisper, "I'm listening, Eleanor," and continue his work. Spring arrived slowly, the snow retreating from Boston streets. By then, Thomas had completed several chapters. He read them aloud to Margaret, who listened intently, her eyes sometimes moist, sometimes smiling faintly at her mother's voice brought to life again. One afternoon, as they sat in the sunlit parlor, Margaret handed him a small velvet box. Inside was a locket, tarnished with age. "My mother wore this often," she said. "I never knew what it meant to her, but now I suspect Jonathan gave it to her. Perhaps it will guide you." Thomas accepted it with reverence, feeling its weight in his palm. The locket opened to reveal a tiny photograph of a young man in naval uniform. Jonathan Harrington, his gaze steady, his expression both proud and tender. The sight of his face after all the words, all the research, left Thomas breathless. Jonathan was no longer just a name in ink, but a man of flesh and blood, a man who had loved and been loved. That night, Thomas placed a locket beside the letters on his desk. For the first time in months, he slept peacefully, as though the presence that had haunted him was now content. But peace was not permanent. The deeper he went into the story, the more he realized there were still unanswered questions. Why had the suitcase with the letters been hidden in the attic of his building? Had Eleanor herself placed it there? Or had someone else? The building on Marlborough Street suddenly felt like more than a place of residence. It felt like part of the story. He resolved to investigate its past. City records revealed that the building had once been owned by the Cartwright family in the 1950s, after Eleanor's marriage. It was possible, then, that the suitcase had been moved there when the family rented part of property, later forgotten as tenants came and went. The realization left him shaken. The very apartment he lived in might once have been Eleanor's refuge, the place where she tucked away her memories. He looked at the walls, the floors, even the ceiling with new eyes. Every creak, every shadow seemed to echo her presence. As he sat at his desk, the letters spread before him, he whispered again, "I'm listening." And in the hush of the Boston night, he almost thought he heard a reply. The discovery that his own apartment building had once belonged to the Cartwright family altered everything for Thomas. No longer was it just a coincidence that the suitcase had been left behind. It felt deliberate, as though the past had been waiting for him in particular. He began to wander the building at odd hours, tracing the banisters, running his hand along the chip paint of the stairwell, wondering which of these surfaces Eleanor might have touched. At night, he found himself lingering in the attic longer than necessary, sitting cross-legged on the wooden boards, the smell of dust and old varnish heavy in the air. He would place the letters before him, reading them aloud softly to the dim light bulb overhead, as though rehearsing a dialogue with a ghost. Sometimes he thought he heard the faintest stir of movement behind him, though whenever he turned, there was nothing but shadows. The intensity of his obsession began to show in his daily life. He forgot appointments at Harvard, missed lunches with colleagues, and his lectures grew scattered. Students noticed him pausing mid-sentence, lost in thought, as though he were listening to voices no one else could hear. His supervisor gently reminded him that his fellowship required him to publish work on British colonial history, not American family secrets. But Thomas only nodded absent-mindedly. The truth was, the story of Eleanor and Jonathan consumed him more than any research ever had. One late evening in March, unable to sleep, he walked the length of Marlborough Street, the chill of early spring air biting his face. The city was quiet, save for the occasional car. When he returned to his building, he stopped before the front door, staring up at the darkened windows. A strange certainty settled in him. Eleanor had lived here, had hidden her secrets here, and somehow, across 70 years, she had chosen him to uncover them. The next morning, he went back to see Margaret. She greeted him with her usual calmness, though concern showed in her eyes. "You look tired," she remarked gently, pouring tea. "I hardly sleep," he admitted. "I keep thinking about why the suitcase was there in that attic. Do you think your mother left it herself?" Margaret considered. "It's possible. After my father died, we moved briefly into another property owned by the family. I was young then, perhaps 10. We didn't stay long, but my mother always seemed uneasy there. I never knew why. Perhaps she placed the letters away herself, too painful to keep near, yet too precious to destroy." Her words confirmed what Thomas already suspected. The suitcase was not simply forgotten. It was hidden. Eleanor had chosen to place her love where it might one day be found, but only when time had softened the danger. That night, Thomas dreamed vividly. He was standing in the attic again, the letters before him, but this time Eleanor herself stood across from him. Her dress was of another era, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes luminous with sorrow. She spoke no words, but lifted her hand toward him, as though entrusting something unseen. When he woke, his heart pounded. The image so clear it felt more like memory than dream. He began to write with new urgency. His manuscript grew in depth and emotion. Each chapter unfolded like a confession, not only of Eleanor's hidden life, but his own entanglement with it. He described the letters in detail, the trembling of ink where Jonathan's hand had hesitated, the smudges where Eleanor must have held them often. He wrote of his own nights in the attic, the uncanny sense of presence, the dream that would not leave him. Yet the deeper he wrote, the more his personal life unraveled. His supervisor grew frustrated at his neglect of assigned work. A colleague from Cambridge, visiting Boston, remarked that he looked haunted. Even Margaret, though supportive, began to worry about his health. One evening, as they sat in her parlor, she said, "Thomas, you must take care. I am grateful you are giving my mother a voice, but do not lose yourself in her silence. She lived her life. You must live yours." Thomas wanted to agree, but the truth was harder. He felt bound to Eleanor as though by invisible thread. Her sorrow had become her story his purpose. As spring turned to summer, he decided to visit Jonathan Harrington's grave. Through city records, he had found its location, a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Boston. The day was warm, the air thick with the scent of grass and pine. He walked slowly among the rows until he found the stone, Jonathan Harrington, 1922 to 1948. The inscription was simple, the granite weathered. Thomas knelt, placing the locket Margaret had given him gently against the stone. For a long while he sat there in silence, the buzzing of insects and distant call of birds the only sounds. He whispered aloud, not knowing if anyone or anything listened. "She never stopped loving you," he said softly, "and she carried it all her life." The wind stirred the trees, and he thought of Eleanor standing here long ago, perhaps in secret, mourning what she could never name aloud. When he returned to his apartment that evening, the air inside felt different, warmer, lighter, as though something had been acknowledged. He wrote through the night, words flowing more freely than before, no longer burdened by uncertainty, but carried by conviction. His manuscript neared completion by autumn. He read passages aloud to Margaret, who sometimes wept quietly, sometimes smiled with a wistful tenderness. She told him stories of her childhood, details of her mother's mannerisms, the way she hummed softly while sewing, the faraway look in her eyes when music drifted in from the street. Thomas wove these into the text, shaping Eleanor not as a tragic figure, but as a woman fully alive, caught between love and duty. As he prepared to share the work beyond their small circle, doubts returned. How would Boston react? The Cartwright name still carried weight in certain circles, and to reveal a hidden romance might stir old resentments. He voiced these concerns to Margaret, who listened patiently. "My mother's truth matters more than reputation," she said firmly. "If some disapprove, so be it. Let them. Her story is not for them. It is for those who know what it is to love in silence." Encouraged, Thomas submitted his manuscript to a publisher specializing in historical memoirs. Weeks passed in anxious waiting, but at last a letter arrived. They were deeply moved by his work and wished to publish it. When he shared the news with Margaret, she clasped his hands tightly. "Then my mother will finally be heard." The weeks that followed were a blur of editing, proofs, and preparations. The book was scheduled for release in the spring of the following year. Word began to spread quietly, and interest grew. Local historians, journalists, even descendants of old Boston families reached out. Some were curious, others wary. On the night before the first public reading, Thomas sat once more in his attic. The original letters spread before him. He traced the handwriting with his fingers. The ink faded but still alive. "I've done all I can," he whispered into the silence. "Tomorrow they will know your story." A stillness settled around him, deeper than any he had felt before. For the first time since the discovery, he sensed no presence, No watchful gaze. Only peace. The following evening, he stood in a hall filled with strangers, the manuscript in his hand, Margaret seated proudly in the front row. His voice trembled at first as he began to read Eleanor's words, but soon it steadied, carried by something greater than himself. The audience leaned forward, hushed, as though the very air held its breath. In that moment, Boston listened. Eleanor Cartwright's voice, silenced for decades, spoke again through the ink she had left behind. And for Thomas, the Englishman who had stumbled into her world, it was not just history he'd uncovered. It was a reminder that even the most forgotten letters can echo louder than time itself. The silence of that Boston apartment never truly returned to what it had been before the letter was discovered. Amelia found herself listening more carefully to the creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the heating system, the muted conversations of neighbors she had never bothered to notice before. The letter had shifted her awareness, as though the walls carried whispers from the past that demanded her attention. Each evening after work, she would sit at the small wooden desk near the window with a cup of tea and spread the letter on the surface. The ink was faded, but the words remained strong, filled with longing and something close to desperation. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and Amelia read that opening line over and over, tracing the name with her fingertip. She imagined a woman in the 1940s, perhaps in a modest apartment on the same street, waiting for someone who never returned. The curiosity became almost unbearable. One Saturday morning in late November, the sky heavy with the threat of snow, Amelia decided she could not leave the matter alone. She wrapped herself in her navy coat, slipped on her gloves, and headed toward the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street. The building, with its grand stone facade and quiet majesty, had always impressed her, but that day it felt like a gateway to answers. Inside, the scent of old paper and polish which surrounded her, comforting and daunting at once. At the genealogy section, she met a librarian named Thomas, a man in his 60s with silver hair and round spectacles. She unfolded the letter carefully and asked if he might guide her in searching for names. Thomas adjusted his glasses and studied the paper for a long moment, his lips pressing into a line as though he, too, could feel the weight of the past seeping from it. "We can try," he said finally. "If this letter was written here, there might be records, marriages, deaths, addresses." The two of them spent hours combing through microfilm, old city directories, and digitized archives. The flickering light of the microfilm reader made Amelia's eyes ache, but she persisted. Each name, each address that appeared on the screen felt like a step closer. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair and pointed to a record from 1943. "Eleanor Whitcomb," he read aloud, "residing on Marlborough Street. Occupation listed as seamstress. 22 years old." Amelia's heart raced. She whispered the name as though speaking it aloud might bring the woman closer. Eleanor Whitcomb. The name had lived silently in folded paper for decades, and now it filled the hushed corners of the library once again. But there was more. Thomas pulled another record, this one of a soldier, Private James Harrington, who had been listed as missing in action in 1944. The letter Amelia had found was signed, "Forever yours, James." Her throat tightened. The weight of history pressed in from every side. James had written to Eleanor, but had Eleanor ever received this letter? Or had it been left behind, forgotten, waiting to be found generations later? She looked at the librarian, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she ever knew?" Thomas shook his head slowly. Sometimes the war took more than lives. It took closure. People were left waiting for answers that never came. That night, back in her apartment, Amelia lit a single candle and placed it beside the letter. She read it aloud, her voice trembling as she gave breath once more to James's words. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to sway with the rhythm of her voice. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, setting it near the candle like a relic. Days passed, yet the mystery did not loosen its grip. Amelia began dreaming of Eleanor, a woman she had never met. In her dreams, Eleanor stood at the window of a dimly lit room, watching the street below as snow drifted down in silence. She wore a dress of muted blue, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes filled with waiting. Sometimes James appeared too, his uniform dusty, his face weary yet kind. He would reach out to Eleanor, but the dream always ended before their hands touched. On December 10th, with snow piled against the curbs and Christmas lights glowing in shop windows, Amelia made her way to Marlborough Street. She walked slowly, her boots crunching in the snow, searching for the address Thomas had found. When she reached it, she stopped. The building was old but well kept, with ivy clinging stubbornly to the brick even in winter. The windows glowed faintly, as though stories still lived inside. She stood there for a long time, imagining Eleanor climbing those steps, her heart heavy with unspoken words. An elderly woman exited the building, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. Amelia hesitated, then stepped forward. "Excuse me," she began softly. "Did you ever hear someone named Eleanor Wickham who might have lived here?" The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "My grandmother mentioned an Eleanor once," the woman replied. "Said she was a lovely young woman, but very quiet. She lived here during the war, I believe. Then one day she was gone. No one ever spoke of her again." Amelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. She thanked the woman and stepped back, her breath clouding in the cold air. Eleanor had been real, tangible. Her life brushed against this very street. Yet she had slipped into silence, leaving behind only a name, an address, and a letter that never reached her. That evening, Amelia returned home with a resolve she had not felt before. She could not allow the story to end there. She began writing, carefully documenting what she had discovered. The letter, the records, the street, the fragment of memory shared by the stranger. Each word she typed felt like stitching together a torn fabric, preserving the memory of two people whose voices had almost vanished. But as the nights grew longer, Amelia began to notice something unsettling. At times, when she read the letter aloud, she thought she heard another voice layered faintly with hers, like an echo in the room, a low male voice filled with tenderness. Other times, while drifting into sleep, she felt a weight beside her on the bed, the impression of someone sitting quietly, watching. She would open her eyes to find the room empty, the candle flickering weakly. It was no longer just research. It was as if Eleanor and James had followed her back into present, their unfinished story clinging to her life, waiting for her to carry it forward. And Amelia, both frightened and compelled, could not turn away. The more she searched, the deeper she sank into their world. Old newspapers revealed glimpses of Eleanor's name, listed once in an advertisement for tailoring services, another time mentioned in connection with a church charity event. But after 1945, the name disappeared. No marriage records, no death records, no trace. It was as if she had dissolved into the shadows of history. And then, one late night in December, as the snowstorm raged against the windows, Amelia discovered something in the archives that made her heart freeze. A short article, dated 1946, describing a young woman found near the Charles River, her identity uncertain but matching the description of Eleanor. The article was brief, almost dismissive, but Amelia's hands shook as she read it. She whispered into the empty room, "Eleanor, what happened to you?" The candle flickered violently, and for a moment, she thought she heard footsteps across the apartment floor. The storm that night pressed against the windows of Amelia's apartment with relentless force, rattling the old glass panes as if trying to break inside. The city outside was buried under thick layers of snow, muffling the usual hum of traffic, leaving the world eerily quiet. The candle she had lit flickered and bent in the draft, throwing uncertain shadows across the walls. The letter sat before her on the desk, the ink faintly visible in the golden glow. Amelia could not take her eyes off the article she had uncovered from the archives. A nameless young woman found near the Charles River in 1946. Her life extinguished without detail or ceremony. The description matched Eleanor, her age, her neighborhood, even the delicate features noted in the brief report. But the article left more questions than answers. Who had found her? What had driven her to the river that night? And had she carried in her heart the absence of James, the man whose words Amelia now spoke aloud every evening? She leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling as she held the yellowed printout. The silence in the room deepened, so much so that when the radiator hissed, she flinched. Then, faintly, so faintly she wondered if she imagined it, came the sound of a woman's voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, impossible to catch fully, but Amelia froze all the same. She turned slowly toward the corner of the room. Nothing, just the shadows dancing in rhythm with the candle. That night, she dreamed again. Eleanor stood on the edge of the riverbank, the Charles stretching out behind her in a dark, glittering expanse. Snow fell silently onto her shoulders, and she looked so small, so fragile, her dress clinging damply to her frame. James stood a few feet away, reaching toward her, but his hands passed through the air as if some invisible barrier kept them apart. Eleanor's lips moved, but Amelia could not hear the words. She woke suddenly, her heart pounding, her throat tight with unshed tears. The following morning, Boston lay buried in white. Amelia bundled herself in layers and made her way to the river. The streets were quiet, interrupted only by the crunch of her boots on packed snow. When she reached the Charles, she stood at the railing, staring at the water below. It was partially frozen, a dull sheet of ice catching the pale light of day. She imagined Eleanor standing there decades ago, perhaps with the same cold wind cutting through her coat, the same snowflakes catching in her hair. The weight of it all pressed heavily on Amelia. She pulled her scarf tighter and whispered into the wind, "I found your letter. You're not forgotten." The river gave no reply, but she felt an odd warmth in her chest, as though someone unseen had heard her words. Her days became consumed with tracing Eleanor's trail. Every evening after work, she returned to the library or sat hunched over her laptop, searching for any scrap of evidence. Sometimes she found small fragments, a sewing pattern signed by Eleanor at a local church in 1943, a census listing her as a tenant, but nothing definitive after the war years. James remained equally elusive, his military file ending in the word missing, with no further explanation. One evening, in mid-December, she visited the small historical society tucked away on Beacon Hill. The curator, a woman named Margaret with sharp eyes and a kind smile, listened intently as Amelia explained what she had found. Margaret examined the letter carefully, her fingers brushing lightly over the faded ink. "You've stumbled onto a love story interrupted by war," she said quietly, "and perhaps by something darker. Boston has its share of forgotten tragedies. Sometimes people slip through the cracks, especially women without family to fight for their memory." Amelia felt both a chill and a strange responsibility settle over her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like a duty. If no one else remembered Eleanor, she would. That night, she brought the letter back to her apartment and placed it carefully in a frame. It seemed wrong to let it remain folded away in the envelope. She hung it on the wall above her desk, the ink faint but legible, James's final words preserved. For the first time since she had found it, she felt she had given it a place of honor, but the presence in her apartment grew stronger. Some nights, as she wrote, she felt someone behind her shoulder, watching the words appear on the screen. Once, she smelled faint lavender in the air, though she owned no lavender perfume. Another time, when she set down her pen, it rolled slowly across the desk without a touch. She sat frozen, her breath caught in her throat, until it stopped at the edge. On Christmas Eve, unable to resist the pull, she returned to Marlborough Street. The building where Eleanor had once lived glowed warmly with holiday lights, wreaths hanging on each door. Families bustled inside, laughter spilling into the frosty night. Amelia stood at the foot of the steps, imagining Eleanor there during the war, waiting for James, her heart heavy but still clinging to hope. She whispered softly, "Merry Christmas, Eleanor." Snow began to fall, soft and silent, and for a moment Amelia thought she saw a figure in the upstairs window, a young woman with dark hair, looking out onto the street. She blinked, and the window was empty. The weeks stretched into January, and still Amelia searched. She found herself less interested in the bustling modern city, and more absorbed in the faded maps and directories of the 1940s. The world she lived in and the world Eleanor had inhabited blurred until she sometimes lost track of time. Her friends called, inviting her out, but she often declined, claiming exhaustion. The truth was she couldn't pull herself away from the story that gripped her. And then, late one night, she came across something unexpected. In the archives of a small Boston newspaper long since defunct, she found a letter to the editor dated February 1946. It was unsigned, written only as "A Grieving Heart." The words were hauntingly familiar, a plea for someone to remember a woman who had been lost, a woman who had loved and had been loved, yet who now lay unnamed in death. The handwriting was strikingly similar to James's, though shakier, as though written in great pain. Amelia stared at the scan, her pulse quickening. If James had survived long enough to write that letter, perhaps he had returned from the war after all. Perhaps he had searched for Eleanor, only to discover her fate too late. Her eyes burned with tears. The tragedy deepened, and yet so did her determination. She whispered into the stillness of her apartment, "I'll keep your story alive, both of you." The candle on her desk flickered, and for just an instant, she thought she saw two shadows on the wall, one tall and broad, the other slender and graceful, standing side by side. But the mystery was not yet finished. There were more threads to pull, more silences to fill, and Amelia could not let go. The letter had chosen her, and until she uncovered all it had to reveal, she knew sleep would never come easily again. The winter in Boston lingered long after the holidays had passed, clinging to the streets with stubborn frost that refused to thaw. For Amelia, the cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones each day, though it was not only the weather that chilled her. It was the way of the mystery, the sense that she was being drawn further and further into the story of Eleanor and James. Her apartment had become less of a home and more of a shrine. The framed letter hung above her desk like an icon, and beside it, stacks of photocopies, handwritten notes, and printouts grew higher each week. She rarely entertained guests anymore. Friends began to tease her gently, asking why she never came out for drinks or weekend brunches. But her excuses grew thin. She couldn't tell them the truth, that she felt she was living not only her own life, but also two unfinished lives that press against hers from the past. One stormy evening in late January, Amelia was organizing some of the boxes that had come with the apartment when she first moved in. They were shoved into the back of the closet, filled with odds and ends left behind by previous tenants. She had ignored them for months, considering them nothing but clutter. But that night, restless and unable to concentrate on her writing, she pulled them into the living room. Most of the boxes were filled with useless scraps, rusty curtain rods, cracked picture frames, chipped dishes. But at the bottom of the last box, beneath a layer of old newspapers, her hand brushed against something solid. She pulled it out and found a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface worn and darkened with age. The brass clasp was tarnished, but intact. Her heart began to race. Amelia sat on the floor, the box resting on her lap. She hesitated, her breath catching as though she already knew what it might contain. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon, a small silver locket, and a photograph so old it was nearly sepia. She lifted the photograph carefully. A young woman stood smiling on the steps of what looked like a church, her hair styled neatly, her dress modest but elegant. Beside her was a man in uniform, tall and handsome, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. Amelia's heart skipped. There could be no mistake. Eleanor and James. The discovery left her breathless. She set the photograph aside and picked up the locket. When she opened it, she found two tiny portraits inside, one of James in uniform, the other of Eleanor, her face as luminous as in the photograph. The papers, when untied, revealed a collection of handwritten notes, some in James's hand, others in Eleanor's, love letters exchanged during the war, some unfinished, some marked with hurried scrawls. Amelia read through them slowly, the words pulling her deeper into the lives of two people she felt she knew yet could never truly meet. One of James's letters spoke of his longing to return to Boston, of his dreams of marrying Eleanor and building a small life together in the city. Another, from Eleanor, described her loneliness, the silence of the apartment without him, and her fears of never seeing him again. By the time she reached the last letter, her tears blurred the ink. This one, written by Eleanor, was never sent. The words were fragmented, as though she had been too distraught to finish. It spoke of despair, of feeling abandoned, of standing on the edge of something she could not name. The final lines ended abruptly, the pen trailing off mid-sentence. Amelia pressed the paper to her chest, her own heart aching. She could feel Eleanor's presence in those unfinished words, as if the young woman's spirit had lingered, waiting for someone to hear her pain. For days afterward, Amelia carried the locket in her pocket, unable to part with it. She felt as though she had been entrusted with something sacred. The box remained on her desk, its contents carefully arranged, but she returned to it constantly, rereading the letters, studying the photograph until she could see their faces even with her eyes closed. Yet with the discovery came something darker. The presence in her apartment grew heavier, more insistent. At night she sometimes heard footsteps pacing softly in the hallway, though no one was there. The scent of lavender grew stronger, lingering in the air long after she blew out the candle. Once, she woke to find the photograph resting on her nightstand, though she was certain she had left it inside the box. Fear mingled with fascination, but she could not turn away. She began to dream more vividly, her nights filled with scenes that felt less like imagination and more like memory. In one dream, she walked through the streets of Boston in the 1940s, the lamps glowing dimly, the sound of jazz drifting from a nearby bar. She saw Eleanor hurrying past her, clutching a letter in her hand, her face pale with worry. In another, she saw James standing on a battlefield, mud and smoke all around him, clutching a photograph of Eleanor close to his chest. Each morning she woke exhausted, but more determined than ever. She began writing their story in earnest, weaving together the fragments she had uncovered. Her words were less academic now, more like a chronicle of love and loss. She imagined publishing the story one day, ensuring that James and Eleanor would never again be forgotten. But the more she wrote, the more she felt the line between past and present blur. She began hearing voices, faint but unmistakable, when she read the letters aloud. Sometimes it was James, his tone steady and warm. Other times it was Eleanor, her voice tinged with sadness. They did not speak full sentences, only fragments, whispers, but it was enough to make Amelia's skin prickle. One evening, as snow fell heavily outside, she sat at her desk with the locket open beside her. She read aloud from James's letter. Forever yours, no matter the distance, no matter the silence, no matter the darkness. And then, unmistakably, a voice answered. A woman's voice, soft and trembling, from the far corner of the room. I waited. Amelia dropped a letter, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Only shadows, only silence. Yet she knew she had heard it. Her hand shook as she picked up the letter again. For the first time, fear threatened to overpower her fascination. What if she had opened a door that was never meant to be opened? What if Eleanor and James had followed her too closely, their unfinished story binding them to her life in ways she did not understand? Still, she could not stop. The box, the letters, the locket, these things had chosen her. She was certain of it. And until she uncovered the truth, until she carried their story to its end, she knew she would never be free. So Amelia continued. Even as the nights grew colder, the whispers stronger, and the shadows in her apartment darker, she pressed on, following the thread of forgotten love, unaware of how tightly it was beginning to entwine with her own life, and how much it would change the past she thought was hers alone. The February nights in Boston were long and merciless. Each evening, Amelia returned to her apartment, her coat damp with melting snow, her cheeks raw from the wind. Yet she never felt entirely alone. The air seemed charged with presence, as though the walls themselves were listening. The wooden box on her desk had become more than discovery. It was a beacon, drawing her further and further into a story that refused to rest. She had grown used to the lavender scent, though it appeared without warning, lingering strongest when she read Eleanor's unfinished letter. The footsteps in the hallway came more often, sometimes stopping just outside her bedroom door. At first she tried to rationalize them. Old pipes, shifting wood, her imagination, but deep down she knew better. She no longer lived in the apartment alone. One night, unable to sleep, Amelia spread the letters across her desk once again. The flickering candlelight brushed over the faded ink, bringing the words back to life. She arranged them chronologically, tracing the rise and fall of Eleanor and James's love. The earlier letters were full of light and warmth, plans for the future, promises whispered across the distance of war. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. James's words grew weary, haunted by battle. Eleanor's became darker, filled with longing and fear. The final letter, unfinished and unsent, lay at the end. Amelia stared at it for a long time, her fingers hovering over the fragile paper. It felt wrong to leave it incomplete. She picked up her pen and, almost without thinking, began to write. "My dearest James," she whispered aloud as her pen moved, "I waited for you at the window every night. The snow fell, the world grew quiet, but you never came. Still, I kept your photograph close, and I dreamed of the life we would build. I don't know if I will ever see you again, but if someone finds these words, let them know I loved you, even beyond the silence." When she set the pen down, her breath came in shallow bursts. She had not meant to write, but the words had poured out as if guided by another hand. The candle guttered violently, the flame nearly extinguishing, before steadying once more. The room was colder than before, though no window was open. That night she dreamed again, but the dream felt sharper, more vivid, as if she had stepped into another time rather than her imagination. She was standing in Eleanor's apartment in 1944. The wallpaper was patterned with faded flowers, the furniture sparse but carefully arranged. Eleanor sat at a wooden table, her hands trembling as she folded a letter. Her eyes were red from crying, but her back was straight, her chin lifted with quiet determination. Amelia tried to speak to her, to reach out, but her voice made no sound. She was only a witness. A knock came at the door and Eleanor flinched. Slowly, she rose and opened it. A man stood there, tall and unfamiliar, wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. His expression was unreadable. Eleanor's face drained of color. She whispered something Amelia couldn't hear, and the man stepped inside. The dream blurred, but Amelia woke with her heart pounding. The image of Eleanor's fear burned into her mind. The next morning, she hurried to the library, desperate to uncover more. She showed Thomas, the silver-haired librarian, the photograph she had found in the box. His eyes widened as he studied it. "That's definitely Eleanor," he murmured. "And this must be James. You're building a clearer picture than most historians ever get of ordinary lives." Amelia hesitated before sharing the dream. She half expected him to dismiss her, but instead he leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the past finds ways of speaking, especially when there's something unresolved. You've opened a door, Amelia. You must be careful with it." She left the library unsettled but more determined. If Eleanor's story was tied to something darker, a secret visitor, a sudden disappearance, then she had to know the truth. She began combing through old police records, newspaper archives, anything that might mention Eleanor by name. Hours slipped away as she scrolled through brittle headlines and yellowed reports. Finally, buried deep in the archives of January 1946 newspaper, she found a small article. "Young seamstress found dead near Charles River. Authorities suspect foul play." The victim was unnamed, but the description, her age, her residence on Marlborough Street, her occupation, matched Eleanor exactly. The article was brief, only a few sentences, but one detail made Amelia's blood run cold. The police had questioned a man last seen visiting her apartment in December of 1945. His name was never printed. She sat frozen in front of the screen. The faceless man from her dream. Somehow, the dream and the record aligned, the past breaking into her present in ways she could no longer dismiss. That night, as snow fell against her window, she placed a photograph of Eleanor and James on her nightstand. She lit a candle and whispered, "I know something happened to you. I won't stop until I understand." The flame bent as though stirred by an unseen breath. Days passed, and Amelia's life outside the mystery nearly vanished. She missed deadlines at work. Her fridge emptied as she forgot to shop. Her friends stopped calling when she failed to answer. All that mattered was Eleanor and James. She scoured court records, searching for any mention of the investigation, but found nothing more. It was as though the city had turned away from Eleanor's fate, leaving her story to rot in silence. Yet the box seemed to respond to Amelia's persistence. One evening, she noticed a false bottom in the wooden interior, a seam she had overlooked before. Her fingers pried it open, and inside, she found a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. With care, she opened it. It was a letter, unfinished like Eleanor's, but this one in James's hand. The ink was shaky, as if written in haste. "I have returned, but I am too late. They tell me she is gone, and I cannot bear it. If these words are found, let them know Eleanor was everything. I will not leave Boston until I find the truth of what happened to her." Amelia's eyes blurred with tears. James had survived. He had come back, and he had searched for her, only to find her lost. But what had become of him? The letter gave no answer. That night she dreamed again, and this time it was James she saw. He sat alone in a dim bar, his uniform crumpled, his eyes hollow. A glass of whiskey sat untouched before him. He clutched a locket, the same one now resting on her desk, and whispered Eleanor's name over and over. The sound was so raw, so full of despair, that Amelia woke sobbing. By now she no longer questioned the dreams, the whispers, the shadows. She accepted them as part of her life, part of the burden she had taken on. But she also felt a growing dread, as if by uncovering their story she was binding herself to it. The days grew darker, the winter more brutal, and Amelia pressed on. She walked the streets Eleanor had walked, tracing her steps, standing before the river where she had met her end. She left flowers there one icy afternoon, whispering a prayer into the biting wind. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing across the river, a woman in a blue dress, watching her silently. When she blinked, the figure was gone. Each discovery pulled her deeper, yet the truth still hovered just beyond her reach. She knew there was more letters, more secrets, more shadows waiting in the corners of her apartment. And though fear gnawed at her, she could not stop. The story of Eleanor and James had claimed her, and until she reached its end, she would not be free. But she also knew something else now. Whatever had happened in that Boston winter of 1946, it was not only a tragedy of war and love, it was also a crime. And the closer she came to it, the more she felt the past stirring all around her, unwilling to stay buried any longer. The following weeks in Boston unfolded in a way Jonathan never could have predicted. Every spare hour he had outside of work seemed to be consumed by the letter, its origins, and the unraveling story of Edward and Margaret. He began rising early, before the city stirred, sitting with a yellowed paper in the dim light of the apartment kitchen, reading and rereading its lines. There was something about the writing style, the urgency between the sentences, that felt so alive, so unfinished, as though the letter had been waiting for him across decades. By mid-October, the trees along Commonwealth Avenue were ablaze with color, reds and yellows flickering like lanterns in the crisp air. Jonathan had started carrying the letter with him, folded carefully into a leather notebook he kept in his bag. On more than one occasion, he found himself unfolding at cafes in Beacon Hill, tracing the faded ink with his fingers, hoping the movement of the city around him might spark a new perspective. One Saturday, while sipping coffee at Tap Bakery near Charles Street, a woman seated nearby leaned over, intrigued by the old letter on his table. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, an archivist at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She was in her late 30s, with sharp green eyes and a keen curiosity. "That handwriting," she said, her voice low so as not to disturb the quiet murmur of the cafe. "That's early 20th century. Where did you find it?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment. Part of him wanted to keep the discovery close, personal, something intimate between himself and the forgotten past. But something in Eleanor's gaze suggested trust. He explained how he had found the letter in the apartment, hidden behind a loose floorboard, and how he had been unable to stop thinking about it. Eleanor asked if she could take a closer look. She carefully examined the brittle paper, her fingers steady and respectful. The ink, the tone, the reference to the harbor, it all fits. This isn't just an ordinary letter, Jonathan. It might be a piece of local history. Edward and Margaret could have been real people, perhaps even tied to a larger story. The possibility made Jonathan's chest tighten. He felt as though he had stumbled into something far greater than a personal curiosity. Over the following days, Eleanor helped him dig deeper. Together, they scoured old census records, library archives, and digital newspaper databases. They spent hours in the hushed reading rooms of the Boston Public Library, the smell of aged paper and the quiet rustle of pages forming the backdrop of their search. It was during one such afternoon that Eleanor found a small mention in a 1919 edition of the Boston Globe. Local sailor Edward Whitcomb departs for England amidst post-war unrest. The name struck Jonathan like a bell. Whitcomb. It matched the signature on the letter, even though time had made it nearly illegible. Margaret, then, must have been the woman he addressed, left behind in Boston, or perhaps elsewhere in Massachusetts. The discovery electrified him. Suddenly, the letter was no longer just a relic. It was a voice from a man whose existence had been documented in the city's very history. He imagined Edward standing on the bustling docks of Boston Harbor, the salty wind in his hair, clutching a final letter before boarding a ship bound for Liverpool or Southampton. One evening, as rain streaked the windows of his apartment and the city lights blurred against the wet glass, Jonathan sat with Eleanor going through their findings. They had pieced together fragments. Edward Whitcomb, a sailor, left Boston in 1919. Margaret's full name remained elusive, though there were mentions of a Margaret Collins in East Boston, whose family once lived near the harbor. The trail was thin, fragile, but undeniable. It was Eleanor who first suggested traveling to England. If Edward left Boston in 1919, there may be records of him arriving in Liverpool, passenger lists, naval archives, even personal papers. The UK has meticulous records from that period. You'd be surprised what can surface. The idea thrilled Jonathan, though he had never been outside the United States. The thought of following Edward's journey across the Atlantic felt like stepping directly into the narrative. He took time off work, arranged his travel, and by early November, found himself boarding a flight at Logan International Airport with Eleanor by his side. The journey to England was surreal. After hours of watching clouds drift below the plane, he landed in a gray, rain-soaked London morning. The streets were slick, the air damp with mist, and the city felt both foreign and oddly familiar, like stepping into the backdrop of a story he had already been living in his mind. They took a train north to Liverpool, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks underscoring the weight of their mission. Liverpool itself was steeped in maritime history. The docks stretched along the Mersey, filled with old warehouses and the ghosts of countless departures. In the archives of the Merseyside Maritime Museum, they combed through shipping records. And there it was, passenger logs noting Edward Whitcomb arriving from Boston in the spring of 1919. He had traveled on a ship called the SS Winthrop, listed as a seaman. Jonathan felt his pulse race. The faded ink on that passenger list, the careful handwriting of a clerk more than a century ago, connected perfectly with the words Edward had left in Boston. But the trail didn't end there. Eleanor uncovered further records indicating that Edward joined a merchant shipping company out of Liverpool. The records were fragmented, many lost to time, but they revealed a man who spent years at sea, traveling between England, France, and occasionally back to America. There were even whispers of his involvement in smuggling during the volatile post-war years. As Jonathan walked the rainy streets of Liverpool, he tried to imagine Edward's life, standing on the very cobblestones beneath his feet, carrying the weight of longing for Margaret, uncertain if he would ever return to her. The search brought Jonathan and Eleanor closer. They spent long evenings in small Liverpool pubs, the warmth of candlelight reflecting in their glasses, discussing not just Edward and Margaret, but their own lives, their own hidden letters of sorts. Eleanor confessed she had always felt tied to history because it gave her a sense of permanence, something to hold on to when the present felt unsteady. Jonathan, in turn, admitted he had never felt more alive than in those weeks chasing ghosts across oceans. Yet questions lingered, heavy and unresolved. What became of Edward? Did Margaret ever receive another letter? Or was the one hidden in Boston the last? Did they ever see each other again? The mystery deepened rather than diminished with every answer they uncovered. And it was on their final night in Liverpool, as the rain battered the windows of a small inn, that Eleanor unfolded another clue she had stumbled upon, a letter housed in the archives of a private collection in London. The description matched Edward's handwriting almost exactly. Jonathan's heart quickened as he realized their search was far from over. If Edward had written more letters, perhaps one of them held the missing piece, the thread that tied his fate to Margaret's, or revealed why the first letter had been hidden away in Boston for more than a century. He barely slept that night, the sound of rain mingling with the restless thrum of his imagination. A forgotten story was slowly being pieced together, and he knew He could not stop now. The letter had chosen him, and he was determined to follow its echoes, no matter where they led across the Atlantic world. The morning train from Liverpool to London carried with a restless energy that neither Jonathan nor Eleanor could ignore. The car rattled across the countryside, past damp fields and smoke-streaked villages, the gray November sky pressing low. Jonathan had barely slept the night before, his mind looping endlessly around the description Eleanor had read to him, a letter preserved in a private collection, its author named only as E. Whitcomb, dated 1921. The possibility that this was Edward's handwriting. Another fragment of the same lost story, electrified him more than he wanted to admit. Eleanor sat opposite him, her notebook open, already filling with neat rows of notes. She had a scholar's discipline about her, the kind of focus that made Jonathan feel both humbled and grateful. Every so often she would glance up and catch his expression, and though she didn't speak, her faint smile told him she shared the same feverish anticipation. By the time they reached London, dusk had begun to settle. The city unfolded before them in all its sprawling, fog-laden majesty. Lights flickered to life along the Thames, and the distant chimes of Big Ben echoed to the damp evening air. Jonathan had never seen a city so vast, so old, its very stones humming with centuries of untold stories. The collection they sought belonged to the Wentworth House Library, a private archive tucked into a narrow street near Bloomsbury. Eleanor had arranged an appointment through a colleague, and the next morning they made their way there beneath umbrellas, the drizzle misting against their coats. The library itself was a cavern of memory, its wooden shelves stacked high with bound manuscripts, maps, and boxes of letters. A musty, leathery smell clung to the air. An elderly archivist named Mr. Harrington greeted them, his voice soft and deliberate, as though every word had been weighed before release. "I understand you're looking into the Whitcomb papers," he said, leading them into a reading room with tall windows and a large oak table. It is not a large collection. A few correspondences, some naval records, but enough to give a glimpse into the man's life. Jonathan's pulse quickened as Harrington set a slim box on the table. Eleanor slipped on a pair of white gloves, and Jonathan followed suit, with reverent hands. Harrington opened the box and revealed several letters, folded carefully, the ink brown with age. The first one Eleanor unfolded carried the date March 1921. The handwriting leapt out at Jonathan immediately, the looping cursive unmistakably similar to the letter he had found in Boston. He leaned closer, reading the first lines aloud in a whisper. "Dearest Margaret, I have not heard from you in many months, though I write still in hope. The sea is colder than I remember, and every shore I see reminds me of home. They say the storms will be heavy this spring, but I would brave 1,000 of them if it meant one more chance to see you." Jonathan's throat tightened. There was Edward's voice, still reaching, still yearning. The words breathed life into the figure he had imagined, giving flesh and weight to a man who had long since vanished into history. The following pages revealed more. Mentions of long voyages to France, worries about political unrest, and repeated pleas for Margaret to reply. One line struck Jonathan hardest of all. "If silence is to be my answer, then let it be so, but know that I will carry your name in every port, in every dawn I wake to, until my body fails me." Eleanor glanced up, her eyes glimmering with both triumph and sadness. "It's him. There's no question now. This is Edward's hand." But alongside that triumph came more questions. Why had Margaret not answered? Had she even received his letters? Or had her silence been a choice, perhaps forced upon her by circumstance, family, or even tragedy? Over the next hours, they read through every letter in the box. Some were brief, scribbled notes sent from ports along the Mediterranean. Others were longer, reflective pieces, filled with longing and exhaustion. The final one was dated 1924, written from Lisbon, Portugal. It was shorter than the others, almost rushed. "My health weakens, Margaret. The doctor speaks of lungs too tired to mend. I do not know if I shall see the coast of Boston again, but I hope you find happiness, wherever you are. Should you think of me, think kindly. That is all I ask." Jonathan sat back, stunned. The words seemed final, like the soft extinguishing of a candle. Eleanor rested her gloved hand on his arm. "It sounds as though he may have died not long after. Consumption, maybe. It was common among sailors then." The silence in the room pressed heavy. Jonathan stared at the last page, the faded ink trembling before his eyes. The letter he had found in Boston was likely one of Edward's first attempts to reach Margaret after leaving. This, in Lisbon, might have been among his last. When they left the library that evening, the streets of Bloomsbury were alive with people hurrying through the drizzle, umbrellas jostling, lights glinting off the wet pavement. Yet for Jonathan, the city around him felt muted. He carried the weight of Edward's words as though they had been addressed to him directly. In the following days, he and Eleanor traced what they could of Margaret's life. They searched parish records in Boston remotely, scanned passenger lists in London, and even combed genealogical databases. A fragment emerged. Margaret Collins, born 1895, listed in Boston directories until 1920, after which her name disappeared. One night, in a dim pub near Covent Garden, Eleanor suggested a possibility that made Jonathan's heart ache. "She might have married someone else," she said gently. "Or she may have passed away young." Life then was so fragile. It would explain why Edward's letters went unanswered. Jonathan stared into his glass, the amber liquid trembling as he tried to process it. The idea of Edward pouring his soul into letters that never reached their destination, or worse, letters that arrived only to be ignored, cut him deeply. He felt protective of the man whose handwriting he had come to know so well, as though Edward were an old friend left standing in the rain. But Eleanor leaned closer, her voice softer. Yet even in silence, his devotion endured. "That's rare. That's worth remembering." Her words lingered with Jonathan long after they left the pub. They walked through London's fog-draped streets, past a glow of lamplight and the distant toll of bells, their footsteps echoing. The story of Edward and Margaret was unfinished, perhaps tragically so, but had bridged time, binding strangers across a century. Jonathan realized then that the letter he had discovered was not only about Edward and Margaret. It was about memory itself, the way human longing refuses to be buried, the way even a scrap of paper can summon an entire life back into presence. Yet still he wanted more. He wanted to know exactly what had become of Edward, and whether Margaret had ever held those letters in her hands. The mystery pressed against him, insistent, demanding pursuit. And so, when Eleanor suggested they travel to Lisbon to search hospital records and maritime archives, Jonathan agreed without hesitation. He felt the same restless urgency that Edward must have felt when writing to Margaret across endless miles of ocean. The journey was not yet over. In fact, Jonathan sensed it was only just beginning. The flight to Lisbon was quieter than Jonathan expected. He sat by the window, staring out at the blanket of clouds below, his thoughts spinning restlessly. The idea that Edward's final days might have been spent in this city weighed heavily on him. Each new clue had brought him closer, but it also deepened the ache of what might never be fully known. Eleanor, seated beside him, filled page after page in her notebook. She had already sketched out a plan, which archives of visit, which hospitals might still have records from the 1920s, and which maritime offices could potentially confirm Edward's employment during those years. Jonathan admired her resolve. Without her, he realized he would still be sitting in his Boston apartment, staring at that single letter and wondering alone. When they landed in Lisbon, the city embraced him with a warmth Jonathan hadn't felt in weeks. It was late November, but the air carried a softness compared to London's damp chill. The streets glowed golden under the Mediterranean sun, tile facades shimmering with blues and yellows. The scent of roasted chestnuts drifted through the avenues, mingling with the salt air from the Tagus River. Their first stop was the National Archive, a sprawling building lined with marble halls and silent reading rooms. Eleanor guided Jonathan to the labyrinth of records, and together they pored over dusty volumes of hospital admissions, death certificates, and shipping manifests. It was painstaking work, hours of searching through pages that yielded nothing but unfamiliar names. At last, in the records of Santa Marta Hospital, they found a fragile lead, an entry from 1924, listed an Edward Whitcomb, age 33, admitted with symptoms of tuberculosis. The record noted his occupation as marine hero, sailor, and his nationality as English. The final remark made Jonathan's chest tighten. Deceased November 1924. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The weight of the entry pressed down like the still air in the archive. Jonathan traced a line to the entry with his finger, as though touching could somehow reach across time and offer comfort. So, this is it, he murmured. This is where it ended for him. Eleanor closed her notebook softly. At least now he's not just a shadow. We found him, Jonathan. He was real, he was here, and his story can be told. But Jonathan wasn't satisfied. Something inside him rebelled against letting Edward's tale close so abruptly. He wanted to know if anyone had been with him in those final days, if he had left behind any words besides the fading letter in Lisbon. The hospital's old files hinted at the possibility of personal effects, belongings collected from patients who had no family nearby. The next morning, they returned to Santa Marta Hospital, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the bright Portuguese sun. A kind administrator guided them to a small archive room, where shelves were stacked with boxes of old ledgers and belongings. After much searching, they found a file labeled with Edward's name. Inside were only a few items: a seaman's identification card, a rosary with a broken chain, and a thin envelope sealed but never sent. Jonathan's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The paper inside was fragile, the ink faint but legible. It was another letter, addressed again to Margaret. My dearest, the doctors here are kind, though I know they cannot cure me. I dream of Boston each night, of the sound of gulls and the smell of the harbor. If you receive this, know that my thoughts never left you, not even for a day. I do not fear death, only the silence that follows, where your voice will not reach me. Should you walk by the sea, think of me once, and I shall not be gone. Jonathan could not read the words aloud. His throat tightened, his eyes blurred. Eleanor leaned over his shoulder, her hand resting gently on his arm. Neither spoke, for there was nothing to add. The letter said everything. They left the hospital in silence, walking slowly through the narrow streets of Lisbon. The city was alive with sound. Children laughing, vendors calling out in Portuguese, trams rattling over cobblestones. But for Jonathan, it all felt muted, as though he were walking to the echo of Edward's last breath. That night, they sat together on the terrace of their small hotel overlooking the Tagus River. The water glimmered under moonlight, ships moving in and out of the harbor just as they had a century ago. Jonathan unfolded Edward's final letter again, holding it in the soft glow of a lamp. Do you think Margaret ever knew? He asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Maybe she didn't. Maybe that's why the first letter you found was hidden away in Boston. Perhaps she kept it, but never received the others. Or perhaps she could not bear to answer. Jonathan exhaled, his breath misting in the cool night air. It's tragic to love someone so much, to carry their name to the very end, and never know if they felt the same. Tragic, Eleanor agreed softly, but beautiful too. His love survived time, oceans, and silence. And because of that, we're here now, remembering him. That's more than most people ever leave behind. The days that followed were a blur of Lisbon streets, its tiled walls, its melancholy fado songs echoing from taverns at night. Jonathan carried Edward's words with him everywhere, as though they were a compass guiding his own heart. He thought often of Margaret, of what her life might have been after Edward's departure. Did she marry? Did she walk the harbor years later, sensing his presence in the wind, without ever knowing he had died far away? Back in Boston weeks later, Jonathan returned to his apartment with the letters carefully preserved. The city felt different now, every brick and cobblestone alive with the memory of Edward and Margaret. On winter evenings, he would sit by the window, the snow falling gently outside, and read the letters again. Sometimes Eleanor would join him, and they would talk long into the night about history, about love, about the way stories survive. But the mystery was not entirely finished. In one of the Lisbon records, Jonathan had noticed a faint reference to Edward's belongings being transferred after his death. The note was vague, a simple line in Portuguese about a box of effects sent to the port office. Where that box had gone, whether it still existed, remained unknown. And so, even as Jonathan sat with the final letter, he felt a familiar pull of unfinished business. There might still be more to find. A journal, a photograph, perhaps even a reply from Margaret that had been lost. The story was not closed, not yet. On the first night of snow in Boston that winter, Jonathan walked down to the harbor. The water was dark, restless, the wind cutting cold across his face. He stood there for a long time, listening to the gulls, smelling the salt in the air, imagining Edward standing in the very same place over 100 years ago. He whispered softly, though no one was there to hear. "She thought of you, Edward. I'm sure she did. And now we all will." The letter had found him, and through him, Edward's story had been remembered. Yet deep inside, Jonathan knew his journey with the forgotten sailor was far from over. There were still traces waiting to be uncovered, still echoes in the archives of the world calling him onward. The days in Brooklyn after that game felt different. What had once been seen as just a simple summer pastime left behind memories far deeper than anyone expected. Faces that used to exchange nothing more than a quick nod on the street now shared laughter and inside jokes, while parents who once stood quietly at the sidelines found themselves swapping stories about work, family, and the adventures of their younger years. At the small cafe that became their unofficial meeting spot after games, the sound of chatter and laughter never seemed to fade. Matthew often arrived early, just to make sure the music matched the mood. Rachel smiled more easily now, even though deep down she knew time could never be turned back. For Lucas, that night on the court was a turning point. He no longer felt so alone in the city that had once seemed so unforgiving. Brooklyn revealed another side of itself. Not just the old buildings, not just the crowded streets, but also the quiet warmth of human connection, born from something as simple as a game played under the glow of streetlights. Summer eventually gave way to autumn. Leaves turned, the air grew cooler, yet the memory of that night lingered, etched into the asphalt of the court that still glistened after rain. Sometimes when passing by, one of them would pause for a moment, gaze at the spot, and smile to themselves. No one truly knew what the next summer might bring. Perhaps they would gather again for another game, perhaps not. But one thing was certain. That night had left behind a story they would never easily forget. A story of togetherness, of loss, and a rediscovering friendship in a city that so often felt distant and cold. Brooklyn moved forward with its usual noise and rhythm, while the memory of that summer game remained. Part of a quiet history only those who were there could recall. And in the end, the story found its closing, not with loud applause, but with a simple kind of peace, warm in its own way, just like that night.